Toxic positivity is very important to address when discussing what makes these 4 stories, Jujutsu Kaisen specifically, so asinine to talk about. Whether it is blindly defending an author despite that same author diverting into his worst tendencies, remaining hopeful in an obviously less than stellar situation, or reducing criticism to either misunderstanding the story or viewing things in the wrong way, as in you're viewing it from a Western perspective, as if the people saying this don't constantly cosplay Easterners while being way too charitable towards authors who probably don't deserve it. Before you're so quick to defend the honor of these writers, who frankly don't know you, remember that these are the same people who write stories that include the snuffing of minorities, the encouraging of a prejudiced status quo, and plotlines that include disgusting rhetoric to cover up an allegory for people that, by all means, we should be sympathetic for. Some of these mangakas are just weird people, man, with weird thinking. Like, take Oda, he's good friends with Watsuki, the guy with Dr. Disrespect level of CP in his hard drive, and he's not the only one in the magazine, and why wouldn't they support the guy? I mean, they're pretty much all pedophiles too. But I forgot, despite some of these people being confirmed to either like actual kids or depictions of them, you can't criticize or evaluate their character, because their stories are ones we cherish. Like Berserk, for example. I'm a big fan of Mira, but if you know anything about his fascinations with lollies or supposed SA kink, that guy was kind of a freak. These Japanese storytellers probably have a Drake Corps embassy somewhere, and there are still people in their fandoms that are willing to defend their personhood. Look, I'm all for separating the art from the artist, but that requires a sense of self-awareness that anime fandoms just don't have. They'd rather fight for authors who are bigoted or disgusting because, well, thing Japan. In addition, there's a subset of Twitter that has been a pain in my ass for a few years now. You know the people. They have the same AI-generated top 10 lists, talk like the queen put beans in their tea in it, and stroke their intelligence by acting like they're a part of the same Eastern culture that produces their favorite overly edgy freedom spread of the day. Their only purpose in life is to bask in the intellect they've been awarded by their peers, while all they're doing is flickergooning to yin and yang. And the stories they like are quite often bad. Quality is obviously a person-to-person thing, but with the amount of disillusionment with societal change found in Bleach, racism, transphobia, and misogyny are also found in Bleach, nationalism found in Naruto, Attack on Titan's whole shebang, and even the comments that come from the authors they love, I start to worry that these bookworms like the queen a little too much. They label themselves as enjoyers, and they're right, but their ability to put up with whatever awful thing a mangaka can come up with and turn it into something deep and philosophical is outstanding, if not frankly batshit insane. Honestly, in my eyes, they're just a bunch of bullies. What I'm trying to get at is, putting these authors on a pedestal and acting like their mistakes are just overly subtextual plot points the average person would never comprehend, or ignoring the weird behavior of these writers, ends up making it seem like these mangakas are anything more than your average Joes. Human beings that are capable of sucking either as people or at their jobs. But you can be a man with tons of money backing him, a degree in creative writing, and have an established career while still being a complete idiot. Speaking of which, the Shibuya incident is a really fun arc, especially in the anime. The Halloween-esque tone, the fast-paced action, and intense character drama make for a really enjoyable experience. Not to mention, it's in the trio of JJK arcs that, I actually like. However, looking back, there's a lot about this arc that just did not age well. Shibuya is great because it's the payoff for plot points, but it was once great for setting up plot points as well. However, I can't help but feel like every, and I do mean every, plot point that was built up in this arc resolved rather poorly, and as such, I think TSI's legacy is a bit in question. This is more common than you think. The amount of poorly aged arcs in My Hero, for instance, is enough to make a grown man dizzy. That's because the biggest storylines of these stories tend to be setup arcs, an ushering in of a new status quo that the rest of the story is meant to capitalize on. But when you don't capitalize on it, then what was the point? For instance, Nobra's death was pretty bad. Her friendship and camaraderie to the rest of the cast wasn't properly shown before her death. Her backstory of being suffocated in a life of boredom was barely realized, and the trio as a whole seemed to only exist to fulfill a shonen quota. But her return might be worse than her staying dead. Her death was a growing moment for Yuji, something that took him from a naive hero to someone who knows what his role should be. In addition, her status was so ambiguous, I feel as though it wasn't even worth the trouble to begin with. There are other poorly aged moments in the Shibuya incident. Choso's brotherly dynamic with Yuji was barely shown. The development for both Zenin twins was sped through, while not even capitalizing on the lore of their clan. And Yuta might as well have not even shown up again if his performance was gonna be what it was in Shinjuku. Even one of the most iconic scenes in JJK, Yuji's Cog speech, is made no later on. The development of his mentality was pretty much skipped over, which includes him coming to the conclusion that he should show empathy towards his enemy curses. Kenjaku is, for all intents and purposes, I wrote diabetic in the script. Kenjaku is, for all intents and purposes, the diegetic author of JJK. Some of the stuff that's happened isn't even because of direct influence. He has such control over the story that he doesn't even need to directly push certain things to happen. They just happen. You combine that with a simple yet honestly hilarious motivation and you have the setup for an amazing antagonist, especially since he's been around for centuries. Especially because he's the mother of our main character. And especially again because his puppeteering led to Sukuna's reincarnated twin birthing that same main character. And yet, we get nothing. Everything involving Kenjaku almost ends up self-contained, birthing the US subplot to his dynamic with Yugi as it pertains to cursed energy. The story about human emotions does nothing with the concept of human emotions running amok, and then he dies, and we don't even get much of a post-death characterization. This isn't just about a merger or high-end era flashback, although those do hurt. This is about the story not allowing the character that represented half of its themes to properly flourish. His biggest impact, again, is allowing Sukuna's twin to reincarnate as Yuji's father, but even that has its issues. It just reinforces that Yuji has never and will never be anything more than a chess piece. A chess piece who says there's merit and value in his role, but in reality, it's just an object for the needs of a terrible jujutsu system. His experiences, his memories, his childhood, his humanity is what would have made him special if it wasn't for the fact that most of it were domino effects of his birth being manufactured. I mean, this kid went from regular high school students to crime-fighting Ghostbuster with no qualms. He's not shown to have any real teenage interests at the beginning of the story, and his desire for others to meet quote-unquote proper deaths, whatever that means, has been almost forgotten. So are we really surprised that Yuji isn't even a person at this point? He might as well be Frisk. My Hero Academia's, let's say, overbearing optimism has been well documented by, well, me at this point. I literally just made an hour-long video with some friends not too long ago. In case you're neurodivergent and off the nitrous, here's the abridged version. MHA is the equivalent of an entire story residing inside of a kiddie pool. Too afraid to dive deep into the topics that might be too dark or suffocating. That kiddie pool is represented through the story's society, a school where everyone is kind, loving, and constantly unified, a system that forgives corrupt heroes and neglects their shortcomings, a society whose response to widespread discrimination is just be kind to one another, and maybe it'll stop. In order to keep the peace and unity that exists within the society, the same marginalized groups that deserve to live happily ever after the most have to get the most quote-unquote realistic endings. Otherwise, the story would have to deal with the fact that the League of Villains all have a point, and the story will have to give reparations to Deku for all the BS he's had to forgive over the years. The manga has to keep the positive vibes in check, because if it doesn't, then the story has to deal with the real-world issues that plague the manga. And the real world is scary. My question is, if you're so afraid of tackling these issues with the level of realism that is required for such heavy topics, why did you put them in the story in the first place? This could have been a fun little shonen about superpowered teenagers with designs that'll give Tumblrites a hobby. But no, you wanted to tackle conversion therapy. So My Hero does put optimism over everything, but just the type of optimism that ignores all the terrible things happening around you. Which becomes ironic because then more terrible things start happening to the individuals who deserve the world.
It's all life matters! Check you idiot! It's Black Lives Matter! Ha ha ha! It's Blue Lives Matter.
Now, this is the part of the critique where I often lose people, so to mitigate that, I hope you don't mind if I rip off a friend of mine. Satoru Gojo is the strongest, that much is obvious, but what does it mean to be the strongest in a manga like JJK? Well, to be frank, you're lonelier than a high school teacher on Valentine's Day. When your loved ones are likely to die during everyday life, never to understand you or your strength, and when the one person who you confided in walked away when you needed him most because of a system you were unaware of, it tends to make you feel like you're trapped in a box. Gojo's strength is something that allows him to save others. People who, if it weren't for him, would turn out just like Geto. But it's a curse, a trap that doesn't allow him to relate to others. Except he can relate to others. Sure, not through shared tragedy or experiences, but he still has friends, a family who we'd never see, God I hate this manga, and students who want to give him the same love he gave them. Hell, when he's gone, those same students charge forward into the future, one that won't need someone like Gojo anymore. Gojo is the type of character who reacts to things inwardly. He hardly expresses himself because why would he? No one would understand. But I can't help but feel the best thing about the strongest trope is introspection. Gojo was absent during one of the most tragic events in all of Jujutsu sorcery. Why did the story, through a narrator, the commentary of other characters, or at least through visual storytelling, not communicate to us how he feels about what he's missed? His death rings hollow because the emotional buildup to it was entirely skipped over, emotional buildup that would have given us context to the fight. And after he dies, his body gets defiled, he gets no burial, his students move on seemingly without a care in the world, and one of the two guys who promised to never forget him dies before he can fulfill his promise to never forget him. When JJK wants to write a character, how does it do it? Well, you're introduced to the character, their personality, status. You start learning what makes them tick and what they need to work on to achieve some sort of homeostasis in their soul. And then, the story skips the process of them figuring these things out for themselves and places you at the end of their conclusion. They figured everything out, off screen. They've achieved freedom in a hyperbolic time chamber. Ironically, in the story that explores what it means to be human, these characters feel anything but. The rivalry between My Hero and Jujutsu Kaisen as both a series and a fanbase has been going on quite strong even as both series reach their end. In fact, My Hero fans that haven't gotten the memo on the quality of their ending are still getting on the JJK fandom's ass for their ending, and somewhat vice versa. One was the emotional cornerstone of its era of shonen. It put its heart first, and that heartfelt nature made the series feel immature in retrospect. The other was a series that made you think. However, maybe the fans were thinking in the off their steed more than they probably should. So, in reality, these two stories aren't complete opposites, they're inverses. My Hero was a series that was so naive in its positivity, and yet at the most crucial moments, turned out to be really bitter towards those who deserved a happy ending. Jujutsu Kaisen was a series that was so serious, so methodical, barely being willing to be emotional at any point in the story. So when it revealed that it did have a heart after all, that the characters had the power of pure empathy for their enemies, and the world was so forgiving that it allowed certain people to survive, I'm not even gonna lie to you, it kind of felt out of place. I think My Hero is far worse than Jujutsu Kaisen. Of course, I'm biased. I love MHA longer than I could ever conceive a positive emotion in regards to JJK. But I also think MHA's politics are more harmful. When MHA frigets its minority characters, it kills them off and has their counterparts react with basically white guilt. At least when JJK frigets its minority characters, it's Kiara. Look, I love her, but who cares? And no, Hikari doesn't count. But that's not the point of this section. Before you jump the gun and mock the series that fell off, that someone you know loves, while saying, "Couldn't it be blank?" Trust me, give it a few years. We'll all be on the same sinking Titanic. JJK's writing is metaphorical, its themes implicit, relying on audience inferences to give the full context of the story, which is fine, to an extent, but unlike Hunter x Hunter, which actually has the passion of someone who wants to be writing stories, it ends up writing the line of subtextual writing and writing that just damn near feels empty. Part of this is due to Jujutsu Kaisen's subjective nature. Some call it postmodernism, where it takes on the writing style that is inherently anti-tradition. Some call it a biased narrative where ideals clash and whoever's stronger ends up taking the moral high ground. Some even call it lazy writing. I'm not a writing expert. I never wanted to come across like I know better than people who frankly read more than I do. So I'm sure there are stories that tackle this way of storytelling very well. Heck, there is a beauty in open-endedness when there's a limit. However, when the message of your story is essentially just saying, "It's up to you," I walk away feeling like much of it was pointless. As in, a story devoid of a message, a call to action, and instead encouraging audiences to just think how they already do and allow life to take it from there is something I don't think I need to read when I can just come to that conclusion myself with a long shower or something. I just feel like this manga found a cheat code. If everything is subjective to the characters, to the audience, if any interpretation or moral compass is equally valid, then every element that wouldn't make sense to you logically can easily just be justified by saying, well, it's up to you what you want to take as the message of the story. Like, Yuta conforming to the enemy's method of strength isn't a blatant contradiction of the story disproving Sukuna's philosophy, cause why would Sukuna's idea of strength be wrong? Yuji still believing he's a cog after all of this time is fine, because what it means to be a cog is interpretable. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. This flawed society of Jujutsu sorcery that devalues individuality isn't wrong, because there is no right and wrong. It's just a different answer to the cast's problems. So it's fine if every single cast member has no desire to push towards living for themselves. They're disposable, which is fine too, cause even that can have merit. It's all about what you as an individual choose to do with your life. It's all about subjectivity.
Fucking commie gobbledygook.
I don't use the phrase other woke nonsense often, but this is other woke nonsense. Let me blow the minds of my viewers real quick. There is a right and wrong. Half of the characters in Jujutsu Kaisen who want you to ponder whether or not their morality is justified want to murder millions of people. And probably have. And you can dress it up however you want, but a tool is a tool. A tool can't appreciate the memories it has, yearn for shared misery like things that are sentient can. It is literally an inanimate object. Therefore, when Yuji says, "I'm still a cog, but I'm a cog that appreciates the fact it's a cog," that's utter woke nonsense. Because if Yuji did appreciate his life, the lives of humans, the spirit they have, and the memories that spirit can carry on, then he wouldn't be so willing to die all of the time. Because he would realize his life has more value than trying to unalive himself every arc for the sake of other people. And that goes for the rest of the cast. Like, what is the message here? We were put on this earth for one purpose, and our job is to fulfill that one purpose for the rest of our lives, even if it's something we don't want, because, well, at least we got to live while doing it. I thought the tragedy of JJK characters was that they had no idea they could live outside of their own purpose, that they didn't have to be pigeonholed by a dream held by somebody else. I thought the story was about preventing more gojos and ghettos, not telling them to lock in and suck it up. But if there's no right and wrong, then the suffering of the cast doesn't matter. They shouldn't be avenged. The system doesn't need to change to protect sorcerers, because the factions and people that created that suffering have ideologies that are just as valid as those held by the victims in that suffering. That's utter woke nonsense! The story may be about having different POVs, but there is still a preferred POV. One of togetherness. The new generation can erase the need for a gojo if they all work together. The superpower of teamwork, one would put it. How do I know this? Hi, Nobara. Yes, the woman with such a vague status that our only confirmation for half a decade was Yuji asking Megumi how she was, and him responding, "Ooh," returns in Shujuku Showdown. Not only that, but Higuruma's alive, Takaba's alive, and even gets to have his own Kenjaku lookalike. Yuta's alive, Megumi even gets a girlfriend. Every shitty Culling Games character gets a happy ending, as if they haven't wasted enough of our time. The only unhappy thing about the ending is, despite Yuji claiming the cycle of curses, the Jujutsu Kaisen will come to an end by defeating Sukuna. I can't believe that's the title drop. It's shown that Jujutsu Kaisen will indeed continue for the rest of time, since all of the characters will be stuck as sorcerer cogs for the rest of their lives, and probably die the week after the series finishes. The story seems to favor the ideal of collectivism, even at the expense of Sukuna, who for so long was the moral center of the series. Now he isn't. Strength is no longer a viable perspective, but hope is. Sukuna is wrong in the end. Well then, what was the point of the story affirming he wasn't for so long? It gets confusing because the story will say that Sukuna's idea of strength is correct, reward those who follow it, punish those who don't, make it seem like his ideals are just as valid as anyone else's, and then turn around and paint him as someone who should be pitied, someone who ought to reevaluate himself in the next life. And then turn around again and say he was lying and say his obsession with genocide comes from the sad Go-to-Gate backstory we never saw, meaning his ideals are to be empathized with, even though his attachment to violence was never coded as anything more than senseless fun. Is he a being who's above our understanding, or is he someone below us? Is his mentality one we can emotionally connect with, or is it just indiscriminate showboating? Why does he berate others for having empathetic ideals while having empathetic ideals himself? Why the hell would he even need to lie about not having ideals anyway? Is he embarrassed? You're telling us that Sukuna cares about what other people think? Why is Yuji, the person who was solidified in his role as someone who ought to kill curses, now empathizing with the curse? What is he, Deku? Like, I feel as though there are 4 different versions of Sukuna, and the story can't pick one. You might say this is because we're seeing Sukuna through different lenses, because of the subjective nature of the story. But that's you know what, never mind. Seeing how different people view Sukuna at first is totally fine, as long as the story either humanizes or rationalizes him at some point. But it never does. His actual personality, his motivations, his backstory is left in the air forever, never to be actually cemented because, like seemingly every other thing in JJK, the story prefers being vague, almost needing the interpretation of others, because it never wants to do the actual footwork of telling us what these characters mean, what the story wants to say, and what the point of any of this was. So what is it, Gege? Is it that hope prevails, that hope, love, and misery are needless emotions in the face of strength? Or is it that all emotions are meaningful, but you have to discard them to prioritize your role so that you can be an effective tool? Maybe he'll answer that in the sequel. Black Clover is a very endearing manga. It has its glaring problems, sure, but during my read-through I couldn't help but fall in love with the cast and how heartfelt the writing truly was. If I had to pick an arc from the story that left an impact on me, it'd be Spade. Ironically enough, Spade has the most issues. Fake out deaths, terrible dialogue, and it treats the stakes as something that is malleable and not something that would allow Black Clover to grow up and mature. But despite that, I was okay with all of those issues, because the Spade arc gave me what a lot of war arcs haven't given me: time with the characters, allowing them to shine and not being afraid of the overly pure hearts that exude from them. And it was that same prioritization of characters that made me all the more confused as to what happened next. Because the cast of characters that the story sacrificed its own stakes to keep alive are the same cast of characters that have their arcs off-screen, skipped over, or rushed. Noelle's fight in Spade was the most egregious, with how many deaths didn't matter, and having the corniest dialogue out of the whole arc. But at least the time we got to spend with her family made it worth it. So why is that same family having their endpoints sped through in this Ultimate Wizard King arc? Why is Asta, the cheerful himbo who managed to save everyone else but couldn't even save himself, having his arc about learning to be okay with that insecurity skipped over? This is the antithesis of what Black Clover is. Sure, JJK can introduce a plot line, skip it faster than you can save potential man and his sister, but Black Clover spent so much time trying to appease the characters in Black Clover, and now it feels like it's adapting a more plot-driven style of storytelling, one that deprioritizes said characters, which retroactively makes the choices in Spade a lot harder to swallow. The current pacing of this arc can partly be explained because of Tabitha's move to a new magazine. It makes the arc so much worse because now, chapters that we would be able to put up with on a weekly basis are now chapters we have to wait months for. Like, no one who's sane wants to wait a whole summer for a ghost fight, but the odds of that happening aren't zero, and that's what scares me. And we still don't know the ramifications of Asta sharing anti-magic, nor what that actually means. It's funny, this video is about the end of an era. My Hero's ended, JJK's also ended, and a whole new list of manga is being ushered into the magazine. And yet, Black Clover is still going, so it can't possibly be the end. But what people who say that fail to realize is that to a lot of people, Black Clover died when its run in WSJ did. To my dismay, and to the dismay of many sane people, Bleach is one of the most influential pieces of manga ever. It gave a whole generation of mangakas the courage, see what I did there, to make a manga as cool, as collective, as dark, and as vapid as Bleach continues to be, even in the modern day. Bleach is about a lot of things. Life, death, our place in it, the way those concepts make sentient beings act in response to it, or in denial of it. But the problem is, it talks about these things in a very depressing way. Whether it is Ichigo achieving enlightenment despite that enlightenment making it seem as though his value is only derived from his powers alone, Rukia and Orihime becoming nothing more than the shadows of the men in their lives, the Gote 13 having their toxic ideologies validated as the consequences of their actions continue to wreak havoc on their self-proclaimed paradise. Every single action taken by Bleach characters feels, despite the narrative's seemingly hopeful message, very oblivious to the actual needs of the characters of the story. Their worth, their needs, and their esteem matters little in comparison to their duty, their role, their relevance to the plot, or the dirty mind of the author. I hope by now the parallels are clear. Every single one of Bleach's flaws, the over-subtlety, the reliance on cop-out subjectivity, the characters never learning of their own worth, the treatment from the narrative towards good-natured and/or lower-class characters being oddly bitter, or the focus away from character-focused drama are all qualities that reside in the new Big Three. These mangakas think it's alright to neglect character, as long as your art is good, your concepts intriguing and/or deep, your battles cool, and while none can compare to the treacherous experience of reading a manga that feels like drastically different stories, each arc with different themes and power systems, except My Hero in my opinion, they all at a certain point come pretty damn close. Although, to be charitable, Black Clover even now is still incredibly sincere. Like, the fact I have to worry about the side characters still showing up and gaining more screen time over characters I actually like is a testament to how much Tabitha still cares, even in strange ways. I genuinely believe most of the final arc's shortcomings come from an exhaustion caused by the manga making experience. It's not an excuse, but I get it. Gege is another can of worms entirely. Has the student surpassed the master? Well, yes, but only by default. Jujutsu Kaisen, like its predecessor, is deliberately vague, and at times just as offended by the idea that certain characters have to do certain things on screen to be well written. But there's a catch. See, Bleach might be awful, but I don't think Titty Kabuki knows that. I genuinely believe he's made something that he thinks is deeply profound. Gege, on the other hand, is aware of his own flaws. The same pacing issues we had with Culling games, the same sense that the games were messy and needless in retrospect, the issues that plagued Megumi's arc that made him internally uninteresting, are all things he's talked about before in interviews. He himself thinks that he could have done better when it came to the characters interacting more, or the world building, or the use of the clans. Sure, there are people who still find enjoyment with his writing style, despite those self-admitted flaws, but those people are morons. On the other hand, Bleach isn't insincere per se, but it, and its 3 copycats, almost celebrates self-deprecation, the idea that characters in a terrible, unforgiving world shouldn't allow themselves any merit, that they should just stick to the position they've been given as vestiges for other people's needs. And frankly, that shit is very sad to read. I'm not saying everything has to be happy and cheerful by the end, but if you're going to show us the depravity of your setting and how that same setting births victims and people on the bottom of the societal totem pole, why would you then let the characters either ignore it, accept it, endorse it, or skip over the effects of it when you built your whole story around it, using the cast as nothing more than plot devices, rather than actual human beings who deserve more than they're given? Though, I guess having a bunch of miserable characters is what people prefer? Because, at least in my experience, whether it is the My Hero fanbase's facade of acceptance, which dissipates the moment you remove yourself from positive thinking, the JJK fandom's pretentiousness or unwillingness to acknowledge that the series, deviating from common writing conventions, lends itself to more flaws, the Black Clover fandom's victim complex, or the bigotry that I've actually witnessed and gone through from the Bleach fanbase, it seems like the types of worlds these stories create, the type of world that discourages self-love, individuality, and progressivism, are the exact type of worlds these fans want to live in. These stories are unhealthy, thematically inconsistent, and once again, bitter. In fact, if this era of shonen is defined by anything, it's self-loathing, and the desire from audiences for that self-loathing to persist. And if you think all of that is fine because that's what makes these stories deep, then maybe you do like the Queen a little too much.